There is an old saying that China was ruled by two Dens. Deng Xiaoping ruled China by day, whereas Deng Lijun ruled the country by night. Upon Mao Zedong's death in 1978, China took an ideological U-turn that rapidly changed all levels of society. With Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up, he ushered in a period of experimentation with a socialist market economy, shifting away from traditional state-owned enterprises and collectivism characteristic of, and at times disastrous in, the Mao era. These policies' impacts on the Chinese economy are undeniable, setting China up for its long-awaited economic miracle. With this economic liberalization came a parallel social phenomenon called the New Enlightenment movement, which promoted Western universal ideas such as democracy, freedom, and individualism, reminiscent of the May 4th movement in 1919. This new movement manifested in diverse ways, including literature, poetry, film, and music. In contrast to the media circulated within intellectual circles, such as scholar literature and introspective literature, music represented the movement at a more grassroots level. The high demand for music was part of the emergence of the first commercial popular culture in mainland China since 1949, owing to the large influx of previously banned foreign media and the easing of the monopoly on culture previously held strictly by the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP. Cantonese Taiwanese music, hereafter referred to as Gangtai music, was part of this mass cultural import. The term Gangtai comes from a combination of the Chinese words for Hong Kong, Xianggang, and Taiwan, Taiwan. Here I examine and analyze the rise of Gangtai music as an encapsulation of the Chinese people's confusion, longing, and freedom after the end of a cultural dictatorship under Mao. In the face of state censorship, the widespread popularity of Gangtai music, fused with individualistic desire, is in itself already subversive. It represents a shift in the psyche of the Chinese people, who together rejected the official narrative and independently grappled with humanism, Western influence, and their cultural heritage to redefine what it means to be Chinese. Prior to the 80s, music in China followed one of two forms: yellow music, 黄色音乐, or left-wing mass music. Yellow music was influenced by Western jazz, with lyrics singing of emotions and romance, and was popular in cosmopolitan cities in the 20s and 30s. After the founding of the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, the CCP enacted what Mao had proposed in the Yan'an Talks of 1942, quote, ensuring that literature and art to become a component part of the whole revolutionary machinery so they can act as a powerful weapon in uniting and educating the people while attacking and annihilating the enemy, and help the people achieve solidarity in their struggle against the enemy. The production, performance, and distribution of music was absorbed by the state, and revolutionary music became the only socially acceptable form of music. This genre promoted Maoist ideals of class struggle, revolutionary fervor, and self-sacrifice for the collective goal of socialism, with lyrics often including Mao's quotations. The CCP was quick to condemn yellow music for its associations with Shanghai's underworld of brothels and nightclubs, imperialism, and the bourgeoisie. The name itself is a result of CCP denigration, with yellow associated with pornographic in Chinese. After yellow music was ousted from China, it continued to develop in Hong Kong and Taiwan. In fact, Gangtai music traces its roots back to the yellow music more than 4 decades ago. One of the leading singers of Gangtai music, an essential character to this analysis, is Deng Lijun, or Teresa Teng. Her songs are a blend of Western harmonies and traditional Chinese melodies sung with characteristically soft and breathy vocals. Let's listen to one of her most famous songs, 月亮代表我的心. The moon represents my heart.
你问我爱你有多深，我爱你有几分，我的情也真，我的爱也真，月亮代表
The impact she had on Chinese listeners was tremendous. Mainland songwriter Jia Ding describes, quote, "The first time I heard Deng Lijun's songs was in 1978. I just stood there, listening for a whole afternoon. I never knew before that the world had such good music. I felt such pain. I cried. I was really very excited and touched, and suddenly realized that my work in the past had no emotional force." For many mainland Chinese who grew up exposed only to Maoist revolutionary music, listening to Gangtai music was profound. This raw emotional response was evoked by the means of acquiring and listening to Gangtai music, the themes in the music itself, and what this music represented for a Chinese generation robbed of a cultural heritage. Although China had opened its doors, the CCP still had strict control over media. When Gangtai music rapidly rose to popularity in the mainland, the CCP cracked down on it by labeling it as great poisonous weeds and decadent pornographic songs. This condemnation was in part motivated by the fact that Gangtai music came partially from Taiwan, the island where the Kuomintang, KMT, the CCP's mortal enemies, had fled to after losing the civil war in 1949. The official narrative was that China was heaven under communist rule while Taiwan was hell under capitalism. So when confronted with such sweet music by singers such as Deng Lijun, the CCP had to vilify them as petty bourgeois in order to maintain its depiction of the Taiwanese people as suffering. The CCP even went so far as to launch a campaign against spiritual pollution in 1983, which just goes to show how concerned they were about the trickling in of bourgeois liberalism. Against this backdrop of official censorship, Chinese listeners relied on radios and cassette tapes, which had become newly available technologies at the time, to access this forbidden music. Since Deng Lijun's songs, along with other Gangtai music, were officially banned, mainland listeners had to play a cat-and-mouse game with the CCP, with Taiwanese radio broadcasters adjusting their frequencies in response to interference from the CCP, and their audiences readjusting the radio frequencies to match every 3 to 5 days. The smuggling of cassette tapes from Hong Kong and Taiwan was also extremely common. In just 1980, government officials in the south of Guangdong province seized 270,000 tapes from Hong Kong's smuggling vessels that contained songs such as Crazy Weekend, 疯狂的周末, Racecourse Proud, 马场得意, With Wealth Comes Faith, 有钱有面, and The Uncuttable Ties of Affection, 情丝剪不断. The advent of these new technologies had a democratizing effect, giving people the ability to choose what music they listen to, instead of relying on state radios and broadcasts. In addition, it allowed music to be a private activity. The writer from a music journal recalls, "Looking back to those years, I remember how with other young people I took the risk of being criticized by the leaders, and in the dark dormitory, holding a bottle of beer, we listened secretly to that decadent music by the compatriots from Hong Kong and Taiwan that was transmitted from a cheap smuggled cassette, which was dubbed I don't know how many times. At that time, it felt like the paradise of music." What is notable is that these songs became popular despite political denouncement. With the government's new leniency, the masses took the liberty to go against official cultural prescriptions without suffering from the harsh consequences that these same actions would have caused during the Cultural Revolution less than a decade ago. This was the signal of a new political environment, one in which the government ceded some power in cultural choice to the people as part of its economically liberal goals to distance itself from its Maoist past. Not only was the means of listening to Gangtai music subversive, the musical style and content of the lyrics also contributed to the often awe-inspiring experience. First, the musical style of Gangtai music was drastically different from the music of the Maoist era. Jing Zhaojun, a famous Chinese music critic, described revolutionary music as, quote, lacking in yin and abundant in yang, meaning overly masculine and lacking in femininity. Take Deng Lijun. Her tenderness and breathiness contrasts sharply with the intense collectiveness of Maoist music. Wang Shuo, a renowned writer and intellectual, wrote, "Upon hearing the songs of Deng Lijun, I felt that the human side of myself is waking up, and it is no exaggeration to say that the hard shell that has entrapped and sequestered my body and spirit begins to soften and dissolve. The novelty of Deng Lijun's undeniably private and sensual music appealed deeply to the mainland listeners' desire for individualism, and so became the site of this corporeal and spiritual awakening. Second, the content of Gangtai music revolved mostly around romantic love and emotions, both of which were novel themes to the Chinese people. Through lyrics that shamelessly pursued romance or described one's longing for a lost love, Gangtai music represented a space where listeners can escape from the CCP's prioritization of collectivism for more personal goals. As Ms. Li, a 28-year-old nurse in Shanghai, describes, quote, "One problem with Chinese music, as opposed to Gangtai pop, is that our government felt that love was a distraction for youth, that they should focus their hearts and minds on the nation. So when Taiwanese love songs, like those by Deng Lijun, came to China, it was not only good music, it was a whole new concept, a foreign idea really, that love and individual desire were okay." The overarching goal of nation building, which had gripped China since its humiliations in the mid-19th century, lowered in priority in the minds of the newer generation, who instead started diverting their attention towards more individual desires. The long familiar we of the Maoist revolutionary era began to be replaced by the I as the main subject. However, this was not a solitary experience, as songwriter Jia Ding notes, quote, "Talking about Deng Lijun was actually talking about us. Her music no longer belonged to herself, but became a common emotional support shared by everyone. What she brought us was not merely popular culture and fashion culture. Instead, Deng Lijun embodied a way of life and a set of values. The construction of a shared identity from an emphasis on individualism may seem ironic, but it shows the people grappling with new identities and goals after the CCP eased its agenda of dovetailing their revolutionary cause with personal meaning. In the face of this sudden loss of official instruction, the lifestyles and values in Gangtai music shows a new source of meaning that appealed to many. The Cultural Revolution and the ensuing violence and trauma effectively razed to the ground all notions of what being Chinese or the ideal China meant. This resulting cultural barrenness became a battleground on which Gangtai music, among other forms of pop culture, served as a medium in which the new generation struggled between the cultural heritage and desire for Western ideas and aesthetics. Gangtai music as a genre is a curious classification. On the surface, there is no greater unifying factor of the genre than the fact that they originated in Hong Kong and Taiwan. In the words of scholar Ling Tang, quote, "What unified Gangtai works in such a totalizing term was not certain shared qualities inherent in them, but the cultural imagination projected on and expressed through them at a historical juncture of the PRC, when people were desperately looking for something fresh to reinvigorate their long-stifled cultural life. What matters here is less the similarity of these works than the fact that they all pointed to certain differences with the revolutionary music of the PRC's recent past." Since Hong Kong and Taiwan shared roots with the mainland, but had much greater Western influences, Gangtai music became a translation point between the East and West. In searching for an other, Gangtai music served as a potential depiction of what a westernized China could be. The youth's obsession with Gangtai music represented both a rejection of Chineseness and a nostalgia for a glorified, imagined past. The rejection was in full display at music bars. In those frequented by foreigners and overseas Chinese patrons, indigenous Chinese music was welcomed. But in those frequented by the local youth, there was a strong preference for Gangtai music, while the performance of Chinese songs was met with booing and jeering. This plain rejection of more traditional Chinese music in favor of Gangtai music, essentially more westernized Chinese music, shows the desire of the new generation to distance themselves from a certain kind of Chineseness that they deemed backwards, tacky, or out of fashion. At the same time, however, Gangtai music also served as a way to reconnect and re-embrace a Chinese past that was cut off by the cultural rigidity enforced during the Mao era. Listening to Gangtai music represents this searching. Its westernized spin on traditional folk melodies met the expectations and imaginations of an ideal China. However, it's important to note that this long-lost memory of a pre-Mao China arose mostly from the imaginations of the listener instead of reality. Suffering from the stress caused by the highly politicized climate during the Cultural Revolution, the desire for a China before mass politics led to the people's romanticization of cosmopolitan Chinese cities during the 20s and 30s, which represented the polar opposite of Maoist China. Through Gangtai music, listeners glimpsed what this glorified past looked like and indulged in a nostalgia for an imagined China that never was. Despite official sanction, Gangtai music took China by storm in the 80s. The CCP recognized the futility of its attempt to stamp out spiritual pollution and finally recognized it in 1986 when it became a category in the annual state-run singing competition. This does not mean that the CCP endorsed the genre and what it represented, but was instead a change in strategy from how to censor popular music to how to use it for the state's own agenda. The famous song Descendants of the Dragon, 龙的传人, offers one example of the state's new strategy. Composed by Taiwanese singer Hou Dejian in 1978, it was used by the CCP as a pro-PRC nationalistic song at the surprise of the singer, who claimed his intention had been totally misread. This shows that despite Gangtai music beginning in China as banned music, it can still become incorporated into and used by the state as a source of ideological soft power. The co-opting of some Gangtai songs by the state doesn't mean that Gangtai artists had no political agency. It is true that Gangtai music is less politically charged, especially when compared to Chinese rock, which flourished at around the same time and has been deeply associated with the Tiananmen movement of 1989. However, there are still connections between Gangtai music and the changing political environment. The most explicitly political event was a 12-hour-long Concert for Democracy in China held in Hong Kong on May 27, 1989, in which famous Gangtai artists such as Deng Lijun, Hou Dejian, and Anita Mui performed and raised 13 million Hong Kong dollars in donations for the protests in China at the time. 6 days after the concert, Hou Dejian appeared in Tiananmen and sang his famed Descendants of the Dragon in solidarity, modifying the lyrics of his song into an explicit attack on the CCP dictatorship. Less confrontationally, Deng Lijun said a few words before singing Sad Freedom in a Japanese television program in November after the massacre had occurred. Quote, "I'm Chinese and I will always be Chinese no matter where I go and live. Therefore, what happened in China this year made me heartbroken. Where is China's future heading towards? I'm very worried and I long for a freedom that everyone can enjoy. How sad it is if freedom is threatened. But this sadness will one day be eased when everyone can understand each other. I believe that day will arrive, for which I dedicate this song." The political impacts of these acts of solidarity with the democracy movement are not negligible, but their one-off nature shows that they are more a byproduct of a movement that reached popularity without its support than a contributing factor to the movement's growth. Instead, Gangtai music has been more influential in acting as a symbol of freedom of thought and desire from the political agenda. As Wu Erkaixi, one of the most prominent student leaders of the democracy movement, has said, quote, "If Deng Xiaoping brought economic freedom to China, Deng Lijun brought liberation of the body and thinking to China. Until now, we've really understood that the liberation of body and spirit is more important than economic freedom." Thus, merely listening to Gangtai music was a subversive act. It defied state censorship and goals, signifying the new generation's unwillingness to meekly follow the orders of authority. This, of course, was a byproduct of economic liberation. After all, the likes and dislikes of society are much more influential to a market economy than political ideology. In a way, Gangtai music was a consolation to the Chinese people. After years of trauma and the repression of humanism, the new generation was eager for anything that diverged from the standardized and didactic revolutionary music. The rebellious nature of listening to Gangtai music, its overt expressions of individualistic desires, and the interaction of Western influence with an inherent Chineseness all combined to make the experience of listening to Gangtai music so life-changing and emotionally charged. The power of Gangtai music demonstrates how popular culture can chip away at a seemingly all-encompassing CCP hegemony. Russian-American essayist Joseph Brodsky writes of a similar phenomenon in Russia, claiming Hollywood films did more for desalinization than all Khrushchev's speeches at the 20th Party Congress and after. With new technologies, the Chinese people no longer relied on state broadcasts for music. As a form of popular culture, music represents a grassroots method of social change. Although it is difficult to pinpoint specific results of popular culture, it is both instrumental to gradual shifts in values and social norms, and a testimony to popular attitudes at the time. The Gangtai craze that gripped mainland China in the 80s was no different. With the loosening of the official script for China, the options became limitless. Gangtai music represented one of these choices, and the experience of listening to this forbidden music encapsulated the resistance and dreams of the Chinese people grappling with their future.